The morning started like any other morning. People hurried into the crowded streetcar, trying to get seats before the doors closed. The air inside was heavy with the smell of damp jackets and echoes of conversation. At the controls, the driver, a man in his 50s with a stern expression, glanced impatiently in the rearview mirror. His irritation was almost palpable. When the doors opened at the next stop, an elderly black woman entered the cabin. Her movements were slow, as if each movement was difficult. She clutched her old bag tighter in her hands, and her tired gaze slid over the passengers, as if hoping to find some understanding. But instead, she found cold, blank faces. "Why so slow?" the driver mumbled without turning around. His voice was rough, harsh, and the tone made the woman hesitate a little before she took a step forward. The passengers began to glance around. Some turned away, hiding their faces in their phones. Others cast brief, dismissive glances in the woman's direction. Some snickered quietly. She felt the tension like skin, an invisible wall that pushed her away like an unwelcome guest. "Just get in somewhere. Don't delay me," the driver said, turning his head slightly. There was not just rudeness in his voice, but a sneer that read more than just irritation with the morning routine. It was a tone she'd heard before, a tone that evoked memories of years spent fighting humiliation. She glanced around at the empty seats, but when she went to one of them, a young man hurriedly put his bag next to it, pretending not to notice her. Another woman at the window pressed herself more tightly against the edge of her seat, making it clear that the seat next to her was taken. "You're lucky," said someone from the back row. "You only see faces like that from morning till night." The words pierced her like a blow. The woman stopped, her head lowered, as if trying to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She took a step back, not toward the empty seat, but closer to the door, not wanting to be targeted further. Her shoulders were slumped, but there was still something resilient about them, something she wouldn't let these people break. The driver slammed the door loudly, not waiting for her to find a seat, and started to move off. The sudden jerk made her stagger, but no one put up a hand to support her. "What? You're not used to driving in the city?" he continued, not hiding his sarcasm. Laughter rippled through the cabin. Not loud, not massive, but distinct enough to make her feel alien, unwanted, as if her presence had been a mistake she'd made just by getting on that streetcar. Silence enveloped the carriage for a few moments, but it was oppressive, like a growing storm. The woman took a step forward again, trying to hold her head high despite the humiliation that clutched her chest. But the driver gave her no chance to take a further step. "Look, you're in the way," he said harshly, turning around this time. His face was stern, and there was a look of distaste in his gaze. "Get out next, and do it fast. This isn't charity." Those words were the last straw. The woman stopped, her hands trembling. She wanted to say something, but her voice was stuck in her throat. Her gaze met the eyes of the passengers for a moment, but none of them moved. No one said a word. Silence was the answer to everything that was happening. The streetcar stopped at a light. The doors remained closed, and the air in the car seemed thick, as if it could be cut with a knife. The woman, standing at the handrail, tried to maintain some vestige of dignity, but her hands trembled treacherously. She tried to speak again, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt anything. I just need to—" She faltered, realizing her words were drowned in indifference. The driver abruptly pressed the button, opening the doors, and turned to her, his face a mask of annoyance and hidden anger. "Are you deaf?" he shouted loudly, overlapping the rumble of the streetcar. "I told you to get out. I don't want any trouble here, okay? Get out now." The passengers began to whisper, but no one made the slightest attempt to interfere. A young couple in the corner looked out the windows pretending that nothing was happening. A man in a suit, sitting closer to the door, defiantly turned the page of a newspaper. The silence was resounding, almost screaming. It was sustained by the action, or rather the lack of it. "It's not like I'm asking for anything special," the woman began, but her voice was interrupted by the driver. "What are you talking about?" He laughed mockingly, but it was a dry, sarcastic laugh. "You think I'm here to listen to you complain? This streetcar is not for the likes of you." The words sounded like a blow, loud and clear. The woman froze. Her eyes dropped to the floor and her hands clutched harder at her bag. But she didn't move, as if she couldn't believe this was really happening. "Come on, move!" The driver raised his voice, slamming his palm on the control panel. "Or do I have to get up and push you out personally?" Her lips trembled. She looked up slowly, hoping to meet a single sympathetic glance, a single helping hand. But people either avoided her gaze or looked at her as if she were a nuisance, an unwanted part of their morning. "We don't have an orphanage here," shouted someone from the back row. This elicited a few short laughs. The woman tried to take a step toward the door, but her legs refused to obey her. She could hardly breathe, and every second seemed like an eternity. "Are you still there?" The driver's voice was getting louder and louder. "Come on, get out. Nobody's keeping you here." She took another step, and her legs finally gave way. Slowly, with her head down, she stepped off the streetcar. Her figure disappeared behind the doors, which slammed shut with a loud hiss as if her existence had been completely erased. The passengers remained in their seats and the streetcar moved off. No one spoke a word. Only the smell of humiliation lingered in the air, which seemed to be absorbed into the walls of the car. The driver took one last look in the rearview mirror, his face holding the remnants of irritated satisfaction. But something changed in his eyes. For a split second he thought he'd gone too far. The sensation flashed like a flash, but he dismissed it as if it were an annoying fly. In the street, a woman stood on the sidewalk staring after the streetcar. Her face was motionless, but her eyes were filled with a pain too deep for words. That morning, her world had fallen one more level down. But for the driver, it was just another morning he would like to forget. He had no idea that in a few minutes everything would change. The streetcar moved again, hissing and scraping loudly, as if the movement itself was trying to erase what had happened from the memory of those inside. But the air in the cabin was different. It was heavy, oppressive, as before a thunderstorm. No one spoke, but the silence was not calm. It was imbued with a tension that could not be ignored. Every passenger seemed to be thinking the same thing. "It's a good thing it's not me." In the back seat, an elderly woman in a dark overcoat stared glumly out the window. She saw everything, how the driver humiliated the one who only a few minutes ago had been part of this confined space, and how she left the car with her head down. Her hands were clasped in her lap, nails digging into her palms, but she didn't utter a word. Excuses rang in her head. What could I have done? Say something? Why? No one would have listened anyway. It's not my problem. She sighed, but so quietly that no one would notice. A little farther away sat a young man wearing headphones who was furtively looking at his phone screen. He pretended not to hear the driver's shouts or those who were laughing. His face was tense, his fingers tapping nervously on the screen, but he was actually listening to everything. He could have stood up, could have said something, but the fear of being ridiculed or, worse, kicked out too, held him back. "That's the way to do it," whispered a man in a worn jacket sitting near the door. His voice was quiet but loud enough for someone in the neighborhood to hear. No one answered, but one woman nodded slightly as if agreeing with his words. "We should teach them to know their place." His words sounded like a blow, but no one objected. No one even looked in his direction. It was as if his rejoinder was part of some natural reaction, like a whisper in the wind. The girl, sitting closer to the driver, was nervously fixing her hair. She wanted this moment to pass quickly, so that her mind could forget that she had seen it. Her breathing was ragged. She felt like it was getting too hot in the train car, and she wondered if she should press the stop button to get off. But instead, she squirmed even tighter in her seat, her eyes downcast. In the midst of all this silence, the only sound was the footsteps of the conductor, who was walking slowly through the carriage, checking tickets. He did not seem to notice what was happening. His face remained indifferent, as if the humiliation of a passenger was as familiar as an ordinary morning flight. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror again. He tried to look calm, but something in his gaze betrayed concern. He seemed to be looking for support, trying to catch even a hint of approval. And he found it. The man in the worn jacket raised a thumb in agreement. The driver nodded, as if the gesture reassured him. But something was wrong inside him. An unbearable feeling tickled at the back of his mind, but he chased it away. The passengers were silent. No one looked at each other. No one tried to speak. Each was immersed in his own thoughts, justifying his inaction. There was nothing I could do, they thought. It's not my responsibility. But something in their eyes betrayed anxiety, as if each knew that this moment, this silence, would stay with them for a long time, like a stain that could not be erased. The streetcar stopped at another stop. A few people got off, their movements abrupt, as if they were trying to escape from the atmosphere that enveloped the car. But those who remained felt it even more strongly. The silence continued, and even the sound of the running engine seemed muffled. Someone tried to start a conversation with his neighbor, but his words vanished into thin air. No one wanted to talk about the obvious. No one wanted to admit that they were all part of this moment, part of the humiliation that had happened before their eyes. And everyone understood. Their silence was as loud as the driver's words. Cold air hit the woman in the face as the streetcar doors slammed shut behind her. The sound was sharp, like the final chord of the humiliation she had just endured. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the rails receding into the distance. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't move. She seemed frozen in that second, like a broken machine unable to move on. Slowly, raising her head, she looked around. The street was almost empty, except for a few passers-by who, like the passengers on the streetcar, avoided looking at her. No one offered help. No one asked what was wrong. She was invisible to everyone. Only the wind whispered something coldly, making her fingers clutch the old bag tighter. Her steps were heavy, as if each movement required great effort. She walked along the road, not noticing the houses or the signs. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. Her face remained stony, as if she was afraid that if she let her emotions out, they would swallow her whole. Passers-by noticed her, but didn't make eye contact. A young couple passed by, barely glancing at her. The man whispered something quietly to the woman. Then she smirked and looked away. The old man on the bench stared at her intently, but said nothing. His face was indifferent, as if what he had seen was a commonplace occurrence. With each step, memories swept over her like waves. She remembered her childhood, when she'd been called hurtful nicknames at school, when she'd been denied games just because of the color of her skin. She remembered her teenage years when she couldn't go to a restaurant with her friends because they were only served to a select few. Her voice, once loud and full of protest, had grown quieter over the years, becoming a whisper because protesting brought nothing but pain. She remembered how, when she had been young, she had dreamed of a world where people would judge her by her kindness, not by her skin color. But today, on this cold morning, all those dreams seemed distant and unreal, like a long-forgotten dream. Her steps were getting slower and slower. She felt tired, drained. Her fingers, clutching the bag, began to ache, but she didn't let it go. It was her only defense against the world that had so abruptly rejected her. As she passed the storefront window, she looked at her reflection for a moment. Her face, once radiant with energy, now looked tired and faded. She saw in the mirror not herself, but someone else, someone whom the world considered unnecessary, invisible. "Why?" she whispered under her breath. Her voice was weak, barely audible, but she didn't wait for an answer. No one in this world gave her answers, only pain. At some point, she stopped. There was an intersection in front of her. Cars whizzed by, their headlights flashing like someone else's indifferent eyes. Her legs didn't move, as if she didn't know where to go. Her world was empty, without direction, without purpose. A group of teenagers walked by. They were laughing loudly, chatting merrily, but when they saw her, one of them gave her a short, mocking glance and said loud enough for her to hear, "Look who's here. The old woman is obviously lost." The laughter sounded like a punch, but she didn't even turn her head. She was used to it, used to that laughter, to those stares. But today, the pain seemed especially acute. She crossed the street, still unsure of where to go, but every step she took was a step to nowhere. She no longer hoped for help, for understanding, for kindness. The world had rejected her, and she walked on, carrying the pain that was becoming her only companion. This time, she didn't try to fight. Her heart was too tired and her soul too broken. Her walk down the cold street became a symbol of her isolation, her loneliness. She walked, leaving behind her a trail of pain that no one would see, no one would feel. The carriage was filled with a silence that pressed harder than any word. Only the clatter of the wheels on the rails and the faint hum of the engine broke it, but even those sounds seemed out of place. The driver stared ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. He thought it was business as usual, but this silence, it wouldn't let go. It was like burning the air, reminding him of what he'd just done. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The passengers sat silent, but their eyes gave away more than they wanted to show. Some were staring out the window, some were staring defiantly into their phones, but no one spoke. This silence was not ordinary. It was accusatory. It was like an invisible court in which no one dared to say the verdict out loud. "It's her own fault," the driver muttered to himself, as if trying to justify himself to his reflection in the glass. His voice was dry, unemotional, but there was uncertainty in it. He repeated it again, a little louder. "She just got in everyone's way. There's nothing to do if you don't know how to behave." But the words that usually served as his excuse sounded hollow this time. They couldn't drown out the strange feeling that was growing in his chest. It was something new, something uncomfortable, something he wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. Remembering her face, he closed his eyes for a moment, Her gaze, full of pain and humiliation, wouldn't let go. It wasn't anger, it wasn't protest, just the silent surrender he'd seen before. That look seemed to say, "I'm used to it by now," and it was that thought that made his heart clench. "Shit," he exhaled, reaching for the bottle of water next to him. He took a few sips, but his throat remained dry. At the stop, the streetcar slowed and the doors opened with a loud hiss. Several passengers got off, but none of them met his gaze. This aggravated his anxiety even more. He felt not like a driver, but something like a puppeteer who pulls the strings but realizes that the audience no longer respects him. One of the passengers lingered at the exit. The man in the shabby jacket, who had raised a finger approvingly earlier, now looked at him a little longer than necessary. His gaze was mocking, almost inciting. "You did what you had to do," he said, nodding. "People like her always get in the way." The driver nodded, but the words didn't bring relief. Instead, they only intensified the strange guilt he was trying to drown out. When the doors closed, the streetcar started again. The driver glanced in the mirror. The same faces were still there, but now he noticed their silence even more clearly. Why didn't they speak? Why wasn't anyone supporting him? Or maybe they were judging. The thought made him fidget nervously in his chair. 4 minutes passed, but each one stretched on endlessly. His mind began to replay the moments he'd been trying to forget. That woman, her slow movements, her tears. He remembered the way her fingers trembled as she clutched the bag. He remembered the way she stepped off the streetcar like a broken bird. He remembered the look in her eyes that read not just pain, but something deeper, as if she'd already known this was going to happen. "Damn it," he muttered again, but his voice was quieter now. He tried to find an excuse. He thought about how often the passengers had annoyed him, how many times he'd had to deal with rudeness and injustice. But none of these thoughts could drown out the image of the woman standing on the sidewalk in the cold morning sun. Something about this moment was wrong. He could feel it, but he couldn't figure out what it was. The feeling was slowly turning into a weight that pressed down on him harder and harder. He wanted to go back, wanted to erase what he had done, but it couldn't be changed. He glanced at his watch absent-mindedly. It was only 4 minutes, but to him it felt like an eternity. It seemed to him that it had been an hour ago, but each new clatter of the wheels reminded him that time did not heal, but only intensified the things he wished to escape. The streetcar stopped at the terminus. The driver turned off the engine, removed the communication earpiece from his head, and sighed heavily. The silence of the passengers and the strange atmosphere of the morning journey still did not let him go. He tried not to think about that woman, trying to justify his actions with the usual phrases. It was her own fault. I was just doing my job. But these thoughts no longer soothed him, but only increased his anxiety. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and saw a missed call from the dispatcher. A faint irritation flashed through his mind. Had the complaints started again? He scrolled through the contact and called back. A tense voice immediately sounded on the other end of the line. "Victor, where are you?" asked the dispatcher, a man with a habitually businesslike tone. "Terminal." "What happened?" the driver mumbled, trying to sound calm. "We have a situation. Remember you kicked out a woman at the bus stop today?" The dispatcher's voice was harsh. Victor tensed. He hadn't expected any of the passengers to complain, especially about such a small thing. He tried to answer neutrally. "Well, there was an incident. She was in the way, making a nuisance of herself, so I asked her to leave." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the dispatcher exhaled, as if not believing what he had heard. "Do you realize who you kicked out?" Victor grimaced, his fingers gripping the phone tighter. "What are you talking about? It was just an old woman. What's the difference?" "It's not just a woman." The dispatcher's voice grew tense. "You kicked Evelyn Myers out." The name sounded like thunder. Victor froze, trying to understand why it seemed familiar to him. The name swirled in his memory like something distant, but important. "Who is it?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. The dispatcher was silent for a moment, then spoke bitterly. "Are you serious? Evelyn Myers is one of the most famous human rights activists. Her articles and speeches about equality and anti-racism are known across the country. She's the one who got the Workers' Rights Bill passed last year. Also," the dispatcher's voice shook, "she endured such hell in her youth that her story has become a symbol of the fight for justice." Victor felt his heart freeze. The name, her face, her look, it all suddenly made sense. He remembered the newspaper clippings, the TV reports, the pictures of her at the rallies. This was not just an old woman. This was a figure whose words had inspired thousands of people. But this morning she had been broken by his harsh words and indifference. It can't be," Victor said, his voice shaking. "It was just what?" interrupted the dispatcher. "Just a black woman? Just an elderly passenger to kick out? Do you realize what you've done? News is already spreading. One of the passengers got it on his cell phone and put it online. We're drowning in calls." Victor felt the ground go from under his feet. He was silent, trying to comprehend what he had said. It seemed to him that it was all a mistake, a ridiculous coincidence. But deep down, he knew it was true. He remembered her trembling hands, her tears, her silent gaze that said more than any words could. "What am I going to do?" he finally asked, barely keeping himself from panicking. The dispatcher sighed heavily. "I don't know, Victor, but you better think about what you're doing before things get worse." The call was interrupted, leaving Victor in absolute silence. He stared at the phone, unable to move. It seemed to him that the streetcar car had become narrower, that the walls were shrinking around him. He wanted to run away, to hide from what he had just learned, but there was no escape from the truth. He turned on the news on his phone. A video of one of the passengers appeared on the screen. There he was, annoyed, yelling, humiliated, and then her face, sad, broken, full of despair. The comments under the video burned, one by one. "How could anyone do that to her? It's disgusting. That driver should be fired. That's why we need to keep fighting such prejudices." Victor closed his eyes, but the images didn't disappear. For the first time in a long time, he felt not angry, not annoyed, but guilty. His actions were wrong, and now everyone knew it. In that moment, he realized that he hadn't just made a mistake. He had broken a man who deserved respect more than anyone. Victor sat in the streetcar cab, staring at his phone as if it were an instrument of his own judgment. The screen glowed with news, photos, comments that multiplied with each passing minute. He wanted to turn the device off, to run away, but he couldn't tear himself away. It seemed to him that all this was not happening to him, that it was just a bad dream from which he would soon wake up. A video shot by a passenger went viral within a few hours. It showed him, Victor, shouting derogatory words, demanding that the elderly woman leave the streetcar, and then her departure, slow, broken, with a desperate look that stared somewhere in the distance, as if saying goodbye to the remnants of her dignity. Social media was already buzzing. Comments under the video were flying by the thousands. Some posted old records of Evelyn Myers' accomplishments. Others shared stories of how her speeches had inspired them to fight for their rights. But they all agreed on one thing. Victor had become a symbol of everything she was fighting against. How can such people even work with people like that? He should be punished. This is unacceptable. She's a hero and he's nothing. Fire him. While Victor was trying to digest what was happening, his phone rang. It was the dispatcher. "Victor, did you see what was happening?" The voice was harsh, like an accusation. "We've already received dozens of complaints. People are demanding you be fired. The press has started calling. You'd better get off the route for a while." "Is this, was it because of that video?" Victor squeezed out, even though he knew the answer. "Of course it was because of him," growled the dispatcher. "Do you realize who you've humiliated? This isn't just an old woman, Victor. This is Evelyn Myers. She's known all over the city, all over the country. You think people are just going to forget?" Victor was silent. His hands were shaking and he could barely hold the phone. "I'm sorry, but you brought this on yourself," the dispatcher continued. "We can't protect you. You'll probably be called into the office next week. Think about what you're going to say." The call ended, but the dispatcher's words continued to echo in his head. He slowly raised his head and looked in the rearview mirror. His own reflection seemed alien. The person in the mirror was not him, but someone who had lost control of his life. At the next stop, the streetcar stopped again. The doors opened, and a new group of passengers came aboard. One of them, a young man with a telephone in his hand, looked directly at Victor. His gaze was not just judgmental, it was cold and full of contempt. "Is that him?" whispered a man to someone nearby. Victor heard. He pretended not to notice anything, but his heart beat faster. He knew that rumors spread faster than the wind. People were already beginning to recognize him. In the social media, meanwhile, the storm was intensifying. Activists and celebrities began to speak out about the situation. One of the posts was from a popular blogger. "This is unacceptable. We live in the 21st century, but we still face situations like this. This driver must be held accountable. His actions show why we continue to fight for equality." This post gathered thousands of likes and comments. People demanded Victor's immediate dismissal, an investigation, and a public apology. The hashtag #Justice for Evelyn became a trend, and new publications discussing the situation appeared every hour. Victor's phone was ringing off the hook. Several journalists tried to contact him, leaving messages. "We would like to know your point of view. Why did you do this to Ms. Myers?" His hands began to tremble more violently. He realized he couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. The world he knew was crumbling. Thoughts flashed through his mind about how he could have avoided all of this, but nothing came to mind. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He just sat in the cockpit, feeling his life spiraling out of control. On the street, people began to gather around the streetcar. Several young activists held placards with inscriptions, "No more silence," and "Justice for Evelyn." Victor could see them through the window. Their faces were determined, full of anger. He felt that he was becoming a target, an object of hatred, and it frightened him. At some point, he heard tapping on the glass. One of the activists came closer, looking directly at him. His lips moved, uttering words that Victor couldn't make out, but it was clear from the expression on his face. It was a challenge, a silent condemnation that pressed harder than any shouting. Victor looked away. He couldn't look people in the eye anymore. All he wanted was for it to be over. But the storm was just beginning, and he knew its fury would be long and merciless. Victor sat at the kitchen table of his small apartment. His surroundings were a mess. A half-drunk cup of coffee, crumpled newspapers, a TV on but muted. He stared at the phone that lay in front of him as if it were a hostile object. The screen was flashing with notifications, and they hadn't diminished since the morning. How could you? You should be ashamed of yourself. You're a disgrace. Get out of town. There's no need for people like you here. The messages came incessantly. Victor didn't open them, but each notification hit his nerves like a hammer. The video of that morning's incident kept gaining views. Each new comment was like a small nail in his already shaken world. He reached for the mug, but his hand shook, and the coffee spilled out onto the table. Victor swore, grabbing a rag, but immediately dropped it, as if it didn't matter. Nothing seemed important to him anymore. The phone rang again. He knew who it was. He no longer answered calls from the press or from acquaintances who wanted to inquire what was going on, but today he was afraid the company would call. And they called. Victor slowly picked up the phone. On the other end was his boss, whose voice sounded tense but official. "Victor," he began, pausing, "this is serious. We held a meeting and the company decided that under the circumstances you can't continue working for us." Those words struck like lightning. Victor swallowed but couldn't find anything to say. He'd expected it, but when it came true, it took his breath away. "I can explain," he tried. "There's nothing to explain," the chief interrupted. "This has gotten too big. People are demanding your dismissal. We can't risk the company's reputation. You've seen what's going on in the news." Victor wanted to object to something, but the chief's voice was cold and final. "I'll mail the documents. That's it. Take care of yourself, Victor." The call ended, leaving Victor in silence. He felt as if the walls of the apartment began to shrink, pressing in on him from all sides. He felt as if the whole world had closed its doors to him. He looked at the phone again. The messages were even more aggressive now. "You're a miserable lowlife. Get out of our town. You think you can talk to people like that? Now you're dirt underfoot yourself." Some of them were downright threatening. "We know where you live. You'll pay for everything." His breathing became rapid. Victor threw the phone on the table as if it might bite him. He stood up, walking across the room, but the anxiety wouldn't let go. Every message, every piece of news, every look he caught on the street seemed to him the embodiment of one word: hate. The next day, when he ventured out to get groceries, he was recognized. A woman in the store whispered loudly to her friend, "That's him. That's the driver. You see it?" The man at the cash register gave him a long, judgmental look. Victor wanted to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. He grabbed the groceries and hurried to leave, but on his way out he heard someone say quietly, "Now, let him feel what it's like to be an outcast." Those words hurt him more than he had expected. He walked down the street, feeling eyes on him. It wasn't real. Rather, it was his fear, his guilt, his own voice that whispered, "It's your fault. You deserve it." When he got home, there was another package waiting for him. On the mat by the door was a piece of paper with large black letters on it. "You won't escape the consequences. We're watching you." His hands trembled as he picked up the note. He knew it wasn't just words. People who were willing to do this could do anything. Victor realized that he had become a target. His own prejudices, his anger and fatigue, which he had vented on that woman, now came back to him with redoubled force. His actions were a symbol that society was no longer willing to tolerate. He sat down on the couch, wrapping his arms around his head. For the first time in a long time, he felt not only fear, but shame. A deep, all-consuming shame that was impossible to hide. His face had become a symbol of hatred, but he knew it was deserved. "What have I done?" he whispered, but his words sounded meaningless in the empty room. The night brought silence, but not peace. Victor lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, which was getting closer by the hour, pressing down on him. His apartment, once a place of comfort and routine, now seemed like a cage. The noise of the city outside the window grew louder and louder, as if the world outside lived its own life and he remained in deafening isolation. Every message, every news item about his behavior kept echoing in his head. Victor didn't sleep. He just stared into the darkness, replaying the events of that morning in his head. Her gaze, her slow steps toward the door, her trembling fingers clutching the bag, her silent acceptance of the humiliation. He'd seen it all over and over again, like a broken movie that wouldn't stop repeating itself. He knew her name now, Evelyn Myers, the activist, a symbol of the struggle for human rights. The woman he'd forced off the streetcar as if her presence was a mistake. His thoughts were filled with one question: why did I do it? He wanted to justify himself, to find a reason in fatigue, in irritation from the long shifts, but each time the excuses seemed shallow, pathetic. He knew the truth. He did what he did because he could, because it was easier for him to direct his irritation at someone who couldn't fight back. At dawn, Victor finally stood up. His hands were shaking, but he knew what he had to do. Apologize. The only thing left. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to atone. He opened his laptop to find information on where Evelyn might have been. Her name was everywhere. News stories, articles, pictures from rallies. Her words about equality and justice resonated now with his own pain. She spoke of a world where no one should feel unwanted, but he had made her just that. After several hours of searching, Victor found the address of the community center where Evelyn often performed. She wasn't there, but one of the staff members, recognizing his face, gave him the new address. The staff member looked at him for a long time before saying, "I hope you realize that words aren't everything. Sometimes an apology isn't enough." Victor nodded, feeling the words burn through him. He knew it was true, but still he had one hope left, to meet Evelyn face to face and say what he should have said long ago. He walked down the street, clutching the sheet with the address in his hands. His heart beat like a hammer, and his legs felt like lead. Each step was difficult, as if the world were resisting his attempt to find forgiveness. At last, he reached the house where he had been told Evelyn now lived. The house was old, but well kept. There was a pot of withered flowers on the steps, as if they were waiting for someone's care. Victor stepped up onto the porch and stopped in front of the door. His hand froze in the air, ready to knock, but he couldn't. Fear gripped him, making him remember everything: the anger in people's eyes, the threats, the judgment. But strongest of all was the fear of seeing her, the woman he'd humiliated. Her face was in his memory, but now he was afraid to see it again. He took a deep breath and knocked. The door did not open immediately. After a few seconds, Evelyn appeared on the threshold. She looked tired, but her gaze was hard, penetrating. Her eyes met his, and Victor felt something inside him tear. She recognized him. He could see it in her gaze. What do you want?" Her voice was calm but cold. Victor stood motionless, as if he had forgotten how to speak. Then, finally, he squeezed out, "I'm sorry. I came to apologize." Her eyebrows raised slightly, but there was no surprise or joy in her gaze, only quiet weariness. "Apologize?" she asked me again. "Apologize for what, exactly?" His words stalled in his throat. He wanted to say a lot of things, about how sorry he was, about how he hadn't thought, about how sorry he was, but all those words seemed empty in front of her gaze. "For what I did," he said at last. "I had no right to say what I said. Yeah, I was despicable." Evelyn remained silent, her gaze steady. Then she nodded slowly. "You think apologizing is going to fix everything?" Her voice was soft, but there was a tinge of steel in it. "You think one visit and a few words can erase everything you've done?" Victor shook his head. "No, I know they can't," he said. "But I want to try. I can't change what happened, but I can do something to make sure it doesn't happen again." Evelyn stared at him for a long time as if trying to see if he was sincere. Finally, she stepped back, letting him inside. "Okay," she said. "Tell me how you will do it." Victor walked in, feeling a weight clutching his chest. This was the beginning of his journey to redemption, but he knew it would be a long and arduous journey. And now he was ready for it. Evelyn Myers' story has gone viral across the country, crossing the boundaries of social media, news broadcasts, and table talk. Her humiliation on the streetcar, caught on camera, was a reminder of how far society still has to go to combat racism and prejudice. But, as before, Evelyn didn't let anger or pain break her. She used the story as a tool to make the world a better place. After meeting Victor, his sincere, albeit belated apology was not the end point for her. She couldn't forget the moment when she was forced to get off the streetcar, but she was able to turn it into a symbol of struggle. Instead of shutting herself away in her world, she took a step toward society, choosing to once again become a voice for those who don't have a voice. At one of the press conferences to which she was invited after the incident, Evelyn stood in front of the cameras holding the same piece of paper that had been in her bag on the day of the incident. It was a speech she had prepared to give at a community center. "This leaf," she began, her voice firm and confident, "was meant to be read in the hall to people who, like me, were fighting for their rights. But its place was in my hand as I stood in the cold street, kicked off the streetcar. And you know what? That seat was right, because it reminded me. The fight for justice doesn't just happen in conference rooms. It happens here, every day." Her speech spread around the world. People from different parts of the country began to share their stories. An elderly man shared how he was kicked out of a restaurant for the color of his skin. A young woman from the corporate world wrote how she was underestimated because of her accent. The stories multiplied, and Evelyn's name became a symbol of resilience. She not only told her story, but also started organizing actions, drawing attention to systemic problems in society. People came to hear her words, inspired by her strength. Her books, her speeches became part of the national dialogue. She spoke about the importance of not only fighting, but also of forgiveness. And Victor, though still carrying a heavy burden of guilt, was part of that transformation. He agreed to speak at one of Evelyn's events, talking about his mistakes and how it had changed him. His words didn't elicit applause, but people listened. They saw that change is possible even for those who were once symbols of injustice. "We all make mistakes," he said, looking out into the audience. "But the real struggle is with yourself, and I'm grateful to Evelyn for giving me a chance to be a better person. Her answer was simple but profound. I forgive, but I don't forget, because it's memory that makes us grow. Evelyn became more than just a survivor of injustice. She became a movement. People who were afraid to speak up began to speak out. Those who felt broken found support in her words. Every day she felt her life changing, not because she was seeking revenge or fame, but because she believed that even the most painful event could be the beginning of something greater. At one event, holding a microphone, she looked out into the crowd where people of all ages, colors, and backgrounds stood. Her voice shook, but she continued. We are all different, but we have one common goal: to leave this world better than we found it. That's our strength. That's our history. There was silence in the hall, and then there was a round of applause that went on indefinitely. Evelyn smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that her pain was no longer hers alone. She had become part of something bigger, and this was a new beginning. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. We value each and every one of you and want our channel to be a place where you can express yourself and find support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like so you don't miss more stories like this that inspire and make you think. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a great day and more kindness around you.